Dr. William Pettit, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's good to be here, David. Yeah, it really
Well,
is. Yeah.
yeah, good. It's great to have you. You come highly recommended by an Australian listener by the name of Mitch Laurie. I don't know if you recognize that name.
He contacted me. Yeah.
Oh, good. And also by my best friend, Dr. Dale Ironson, who I think took a workshop with you years ago.
Wow.
And I don't think you'd recognize his name, but your reputation precedes you. So these days, you're known for your work in the practice of a psycho-spiritual approach known as the three principles. But before we dig down into that, because I know you're going to have a lot to say about that,
Sure.
I'm under the impression that the bulk of your career you practice traditional psychiatry in a number of venues. Do I have that right?
Well, the first 10 years in psychiatry from 1974 to, I graduated from medical school in 69, so I won't go in. I was in surgery for a couple of years, and then I got drafted and spent 3 years as a physician for a squadron of Navy pilots during Vietnam War, and then got interested in psychiatry and started my residency in 74, and it was in 1983 that I was exposed to the three principles 36 years ago. Wow. So actually for the past 36 years, I have been practicing, as the main thrust of my psychotherapeutic, if you will, tool, or what I had to offer was from the three, my understanding of the three principles.
Okay.
Now, I did medicine. I actually took course at electroconvulsive therapy at Duke, and I was a practicing psychiatrist. Yeah.
Yeah. But at this time, do you practice traditional psychiatry, or is it exclusively the three principles?
Well, that's interesting, because at 76, I actually have stopped clinical psychiatry as of December of this last year. Until that time, I was still doing telepsychiatry back in some clinics for the underserved back in Michigan, where I had lived before we came here to Phoenix 2 years ago for a grandson. And as I mentioned to you earlier, that grandson, who was born in June of 2017, just had 5:59 this morning, got a baby brother. So I've been here for 2 years. So I don't practice clinical psychiatry, although I am licensed in Michigan and in South Dakota. And I have a faculty appointment at Creighton University School of Medicine and Michigan State University School of Medicine. But what I do worldwide is three principles consultations with people all over the world.
Okay. And when and how did you first encounter the three principles?
In 1983, I was actually had given up, not given up, what do I say? I took a leave from psychiatry after 9 years, or let's see, 1987 years, I guess, 6 or 7 years. Because, David, I just didn't see people getting healthy. I saw them get some relief from difficulties, but I didn't see people really finding their mental well-being. And I think for myself, too, I was still struggling. I was, even though I was this psychiatrist with 26 and a half years of schooling, I had gotten in and out of clinical depression for 21 years. Barely made it out of college, barely made it out of medical school, barely made it through my residency. And I thought that was because of heredity and things that had happened in my life and things that I had no control over.
Yeah.
And so I went to work with a personal, one of those experiential training, adult training programs out of California this was named LifeSpring.
I went through LifeSpring actually as an evaluator some time back, a long time ago. Yeah.
Well, I from 1980 to 1983, I was a trainer, and then the head of the advanced training department, and then the national program director.
Oh, wow. I wish I could remember. I can't place it in time. My memory is bad. I don't know when I went through LifeSpring.
Yeah.
I guess it would have been probably in the 70s. Either
Bob
in the
Causin,
70s.
does Bob Causin name? He was the national program director in the late.
No, but a buddy of mine, another psychologist, was the resident psychologist. His name was Bob Slagle.
Oh,
Robert
Bob
Slagle.
became a good friend of mine.
Oh, what a small world. Oh
Yes,
my
he
goodness.
was still consulting to LifeSpring. Yeah, I've often wondered, is Bob still living?
He's living, but he has dementia.
Okay.
I think it's non-Alzheimer's dementia, but he
He was
is.
he's a fine man.
Yeah,
Very.
we were office mates for
Oh
12
my
years.
gosh,
Yeah,
that's we
yeah,
didn't know that, did we?
yeah, right. I didn't know that. What a
No.
small world, huh?
So I was there at LifeSpring, and I was while I was there, I was told, I heard people talk about this man, Dr. George Pransky, over in Oakland, who people were coming to hope, that had been told that they were broken or had something lacking, and desperate, and more often than not that he was helping them. And so I met Dr. Pransky, and we talked for 2 hours over at the Hotel Mac there over the bridge where you go over San Quentin and Richmond. I think it was Richmond. And we sat there for 2 hours, David, in March of 1983. And if you would have been waiting for me at a coffee shop and said, Bill, is this really a breakthrough? I would have said, David, I think this is a huge breakthrough, but I can't really tell you much about it. It has something to do with the power of thought rather than the content of thought. That's as close as I could have come. The fact that we all have a power that we're using moment to moment to create our experience from the inside out.
Yeah.
I might have been able to tell you that. I might be making that up too.
But then somehow you began to work with Sydney Banks. Was this first guy that you mentioned influenced by Sydney Banks as well?
Yeah. Yes, he was. He was a psychologist, and he's been really, along with Dr. Roger Mills, and were some of the initial psychologists that really saw that Mr. Banks was onto something back 40 years ago. And he said, would you be willing, Mr. Banks, this Miss Sydney Banks is coming to San Francisco the weekend of April Fool's Day. Would you be willing to come and listen on a Friday evening and then Saturday and Sunday? And I thought, what do I have to lose? I'm still struggling to find peace, And so I sat in the audience on April Fool's Day, 1983, listening to a man who then was, 53 years old. It was about 10 years after his experience, his, what do you call it, an epiphany, whatever you want to call it, where he went from a welder with a 9th grade education. He read 4 welding books. And after this experience that lasted 3 days, but then culminated in a few seconds of as people often describe, of being with those people that had this experience of being enveloped in a white light and with a buzzing sound, and having knowledge come into them that they have no reason to know from their education. After which he said to his wife, I have seen what people call God is. I've seen what life is, and I've seen how the two are connected.
Wow, that's quite a marital conversation. Doesn't sound like any of the ones I've had.
Yeah, and you can imagine, here's a welder on a 1-week holiday from his welding job that he's had for 14 years in a pulp mill on Naimo off the coast on Vancouver Island, across from Vancouver, and he said, "Do you know what this means?" And of course, she part of her was frightened, because it sounds crazy.
Yeah.
Right? It sounded crazy. And yet she said, as she's gone now too, as Sid is, he died in 2009, but he was my mentor for 26 years. He said to his wife said, Barbara said, the words were frightening, but Sid's eyes were crystal clear. And there was a peace that I had not only never seen in Sid, but I frankly had never seen it in another human being.
Now that's remarkable. I mean, in a Buddhist framework, I think we would call this an enlightenment experience, right?
Yeah, yeah. And what's funny is Sid that weekend had gone to, which is on the, I gave you that website. If people have any interest, he first allowed himself to be videotaped 27 years later because he did not want followers. He said, I will talk to clergy, I will talk to educators, I will talk to mental health professionals, but I don't want followers. And, so when anybody wants to say, gee, is this a cult? I go, what cult leader said they didn't want followers, right?
Really? That's a good point. I mean, that's an impressive thing just in and of itself.
Right. And we told him, we said, you're 70 years old. This was 2000. We said, please, we need videotapes. Audio tapes are helpful, but they're not the same as getting a real sense of another human being. I mean, even this podcast, it's not the same as you and I having an experience of each other visually, and of course this was videotaped. And so they brought 100 people to Long Beach. And I just asked people to watch the first 15 minutes. They're put up for free by my friend Shane Kennedy, who's the CEO of Lone Pine. They've been put up on this website for free for people to watch all over the world. And there's a Long Beach videos, which are 3 30-minute videos and a 45-minute video, which is from a weekend. And there's a Hawaii tapes about the same. And then there's two that were sponsored by the medical school out at West Virginia Medical School. And the first thing he says is, please don't believe anything that I say. And then he says, I'm not going to willingly not tell, I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't true for me, but if you just take it on as a belief, you've become a follower.
Yeah, right.
You've given up your God-given right to think as an individual. He said, it's different to be a listener, David. He said, if you listen and you hear something that hits your place of truth within you and you see it for yourself, it's yours now. It's not because Sid Banks said it. It's because you've seen it for yourself from inside. You've had an insight.
Yeah. Now, people must have kind of questioned him critically, I would think, since many of you were professionals and trained in science and so on. How was he about dealing with that kind of questioning of dogma, if you will?
He was very calm, and you'll see this if you watch his videos. He was very calm. He would not argue with anybody. Mm-hmm. He said, all I can do is share with you what I see. And he was very, I love neuroscience and I love physiology, and I've been a lifelong learner. And I'm doing a course right now on why understanding these principles is vital to releasing health in your spirit, in your brain, in your body, and your mind. Because when people are at peace inside, the brain works much more efficiently. Mm-hmm. We access that wisdom that's, I think, God-given within us beyond our intellect, where we just know things often. We see what to do in difficult situations. And it affects people's behavior, because when people are at peace, they're able to give and receive love freely and act in a wise, common sense way.
Well, before we go any further with this, I think we should ask, what are the 3 principles?
Okay.
I need things that are nice and simple, and 3 is a number I can accommodate.
It's nice, isn't it? What I'd like to do first is just tell you when his wife, he said, do you know what this means? And when he said that I've seen this, and she said, what does it mean, Sid? And at this moment in 1973, after this experience that had happened, he said, Three things at least. Number one, I'm going to be writing books. He wrote 10 books, 6 of which have been published. This is a man who I don't know, even to his death, had read more than the 4 welding books. And the books he wrote are not welding books. Number 2, he said, psychiatrists and psychologists, what I've seen is going to change the fields of psychiatry and psychology from a mental illness fields to a true mental health fields, where they're going to awaken the spiritual state of mental well-being that is within every single human being and cannot be damaged, cannot be scratched. And the only illusionary looking that there's a difference is just a level of spiritual and psychological understanding. Number 3, he said to his wife, you and I are going to be traveling. I'm going to be asked to speak at colleges and universities, not only in Canada, but throughout the United States and eventually in Europe.
Wow.
And David, those all became true. He was twice put up for the Sir John Templeton International Spirituality and Peace Prize.
Yes, I'm aware of that
Yeah.
organization and prize. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And consulted to the U.S. Navy, to Johns Hopkins, and to West Virginia Medical School. He consulted for 10 years before he died. To a medical school.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's remarkable. You know, that not only did he have this enlightenment experience, but evidently information was continuing to come to him or through him.
He said that there was the big one, but it kept evolving. And I won't go into detail, but I have a friend who was a consultant at a defense contractor that they eventually, the PhD physicist from, and I've got this on video, a 5-minute talk with him. He was the training director there. These PhD physicists, Dr. Pransky was consulting there, and eventually after 6 years, they said, we want to hear from Mr. Banks. So here, if you can imagine, this man with a 9th grade education who's read 4 welding books with 10 PhD physicists from MIT.
Wow.
And he's talking about the 3 principles. Then he starts talking about physics. He starts teaching them physics and saying how Einstein's theory of relativity wasn't really correct because he didn't understand infinity. And my friend, training director, stood up and said, Sid, why don't you just talk more about the principles? And 4 of the PhD physicists stood up and said, Dick, sit down. He's onto something.
Huh.
And he taught them for 3 days. And I had always told people that they asked him back for 3 more days. I said, am I making the fish bigger than it was? Dick said, no, Bill, you're not. In fact, they had me have him come back for 3 more days, and then 3 more days, 9 days. They asked to be taught by a man with a 9th grade education. So when people tell me they're enlightened, I say, do you feel comfortable teaching physics to PhD physicists from MIT? If you do, I'll listen.
Wow. Yeah. And you studied with him for over 20 years. So, he, you know, I'm wondering, you know, what did he have to teach you over the course of 20 years? That's longer than it took to get your medical degree.
Yeah, 26 years. He was my mentor. I think since I was the first psychiatrist that really heard, the number of PhD psychologists, a number of counselors, and but since I was an addiction but since I was the first psychiatrist, I think he kind of took me under his arm, you know, and I've still got a bunch of audio cassettes that I'm trying to save and eventually maybe put to CDs or some other form from him. He would send them to me in the mail, you know.
Yeah,
and
great.
talk on the phone too, and we were friends, and he was my mentor for 26 years. So the 3 principles. Shall I take a crack at it?
Take a crack at it, right?
Now I will refer people that if they really want to hear from the horse's mouth as they speak, is to go to www.sidbanks.com.
Okay.
And 3 circles will come up. There'll be watch, listen, and read. And under watch, when they hit watch, in the middle will be the Long Beach tapes. And I asked people to watch that was the first time he allowed himself to be videotaped in 2000. And I asked people to watch the first one called The Great Illusion for 15 minutes. If they're in 15-minute segments. There are only 3 30-minute videos and then a 45-minute video in the Long Beach. And I say, if after that 15 minutes, you're not excited to listen more, then it's not, at least not now, it's not the time for you. Don't force yourself. But about 98.2735% of the time,
roughly,
yeah, people are, they may not know, they may say, I don't know what he's talking about, but I know it's true. And they want to hear, they want to listen quietly.
Wow.
And hear more.
Yeah.
If they're not listening from but, if they're not listening to argue from their intellect, but they're listening to hear something within their soul that they already know, to have awakened. You know, the real, as you know, as an educator, the real Latin for educate is to draw out, educere. It's not to put in. You can't draw out something that isn't already there. It's already.
Okay, the 3 principles.
3 principles. Then, you know, like Sid said, you can teach a parrot to do this in 3 minutes, so that it has nothing to do with it. But universal mind, you know, we'll start universal mind, universal thought, universal consciousness. Now, I'm going to go backwards from the personal to the universal. As a human beings, you know, people say, why don't you call this a theory? Because you have to have these 3 principles to make up a theory. You have to have a mind. You have to be alive and connected to something that brings life. You have to have the power of thought. And you have to be conscious of what you've created via your thinking to make up a theory. So this is really talking about, David, about those principles, those universal principles that are before the formation of form. Now, if we speak at a universal level, then we're speaking of the fact that even physicists in I think it was 2016 or so, they finally, 44 of them met twice over a period of time, and they came in France. They were together for a number of weeks, and they finally made a consensus statement, even these top physicists, that there was a time in the universe where there was, in at least our universe as we know it, that there was no form. There was no matter. There was only a formless energy. Now, Sid would call that universal mind. Universal mind. A lot of people name it other things, but the problem is people, when they call it something else, they attach a lot of beliefs and dogma to it that separates human beings rather than brings them all, they see their common heritage. So universal mind, universal thought, if you will, was the power that activated universal mind to create the universe as we know it. This isness, there's a great nothingness. The African people talk about there was a great nothingness from which everything has taken form. So even Einstein would say everything that has matter is the same matter in a different disguise. Everything is the same matter in a different disguise, and it can only be made from that formless energy that was there before form. So when I was a kid and I was told that God was everywhere, that seemed a little weird to me. That means my pen, my mouse, my iPhone, my glass. But now I see that if you're going to call that God, that formless energy that was before matter, then of course everything is made of that matter. It's everywhere. And so you hear people, wise people, talking that the whole universe is one divine atom or one divine cell. So you got universal mind, universal thought, and universal consciousness. We get to be spectators. As far as I know, this iPhone and this table are participants in this spiritual theater called life, because they've got electrons going 3/4 the speed of light around every atom. But you and I get to be conscious. We can actually be spectators where we know that that's what we are. And that has ramifications. If I'm really made of divine energy, I cannot be broken. I cannot, it cannot be broken. I can shroud over that with a lot of thinking, with a lot of personal use of the power of mind in a personal way to get myself lost. But I can't change something that's formless that I'm made of.
Okay, I'm following that.
So mind, thought, and consciousness is saying that's what we are as human beings. We are a manifestation. You know, people say, like, they use the metaphor that we're a drop in the ocean is not saying you're the ocean, but it's saying that you're not separated from the ocean. And of course, I guess that famous Persian poet Rumi says, you're not a drop in the ocean, you're the ocean in a drop. You have all of it. You have all of it with you. And for us to start to know that when we don't know what to do in life, all I have to do is to get present in my life and let my rational analytical thinking go as much as I can. And I will see what to do over and over and over again. And I used to think I had to pray for that, to be given that. And now I see that all I have to, if I pray, it's to allow my mind to quiet so I can hear what's being given all the time.
Yeah.
Now, you just need to get some wax out of your ears so you can hear.
In some ways, this sounds like Buddhism. Right? Do you see that?
Well, I see a lot of things pointing in different directions. Sid used to say, if they're not talking about three principles, it's not the same. But it doesn't mean that people haven't been in a lifelong search to understanding. I just have seen a lot of people in my years that were meditating a lot of times every day to try to keep their serenity, but they didn't have the understanding to know that they could live in a meditative state most of the time.
Yeah. Because when I likened it to Buddhism, one thing I was thinking of is that people, longtime meditators, are trying to quiet their mind, which is, and so I think Buddhism is also saying, if you can still your mind enough and get your intellect out of the way, that you will maybe have an experience, the ultimate experience being what they've called enlightenment, which it sounds like Sid got that spontaneously, which there are other accounts of people who've just gotten it, just all at once. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the difference is there's no techniques here. It's that as people incrementally, not through intellectual, but through insight, if they're open to it, as they start to have, Sid would say that there's an infinite number of doors of insight related to the nature of these principles. Now, I tell people the last time I looked in my math book, infinite is a really big number.
Yeah. Right.
So whenever you really, as you have insights, my experience is, as you have insights into the nature of this, effortlessly, and it's just an ease to it, that you incrementally live more of the time. I guess as a Buddhist, and I don't claim to be a top student of Buddhism, but you spend more time awake and less time asleep. in as far as Buddha, that we're awake and then we fall asleep to our get caught up in our thinking and get caught up in this world, and then we wake up and realize where it's coming from. And I would say every 6 months of my last 36 years have been more gentler inside than the 6 months previous. And so that's really nice. Yeah.
Gentler inside, you say?
Yes.
Gentler. Yeah.
Yeah, gentler. My mind is quieter. At 76, and I'll be 77 in just a couple of months, I'm going to be celebrating it, doing it through Principles program in Bergen, Norway. I never thought I'd be doing that. You know, I'm doing one in Denmark. I'm doing one in London. I'm doing one in Prague. Doing one in Bucharest, Romania. I had no idea, but people want to be at peace. And you know, I started out in surgery, and the reason I liked surgery is because I liked the results. I liked the practicality of it. People would come in with a hot appendix or a hot gallbladder, and you took it out, and they felt and they did better.
Yeah.
And that's what I like about the principles, is that as people get an understanding of the principles, their life changes. Gently.
So there was nothing you found in talk therapy, let's say, as a psychiatrist, that seemed to be as effective as what you're talking about now. I
had 6 wonderful psychiatrists. I know psychiatrists get a bad rap these days. I had 6 psychiatrists that tried to help me with my clinical depression. And not one of, I sat with Mr. Banks for 15 minutes and knew that he knew 1,000 times more about mental health than I did. Mm-hmm. You know, I had 800 lectures on mental illness and medications, David. I did not have one lecture on mental health in 5 years of residence.
Right, yeah.
And I sat with Mr. Banks for first 15 minutes. I listened, and I knew that it was humbling, but it was also hopeful, because I had been innocently, I thought that my depression had been created by things that had happened in my life, or things that were happening right now, or things that I had done. And I had no idea that it was instead being created and perpetuated by what I was doing moment to moment with these gifts of mind, thought, and consciousness that I was.
Which was what? What were you?
I was spending 6 to 9 hours a day in worry, guilt, resentment, upset, overanalyzing, unresolved grief.
You were able to just step out of that? You were able to step out of that somehow?
Incrementally, as I saw that I was the one doing that. I saw it. I know this will sound impossible to some people, David, but 6 months after I learned this, I was sitting in a state hospital in my hometown in Illinois with a psychologist and a group of 23 people with the diagnosis of chronic schizophrenia. And this is just to show, and now over the years, and I have 14 podcasts that I did 3 to 10 hours research for each one, of stories of hope from the last 36 years from every major diagnostic category. And there's a number of them with schizophrenia and psychosis. But my first one was sitting with this group. This man had sat in the corner for the first 2 groups. This was the 3rd group. He was sitting cattywampus, kind of listening to voices and talking. And he'd been in the state hospital. They'd tried a couple of times. He was 67 years old. He'd been in there for 47 years.
Yeah.
During the 3rd talk, he started laughing. And it wasn't just a giggle. It was one of those belly laughs, David, that we've all been around people. And before you know it, you're holding your stomach, your eyes are watering, and you're begging the person to stop, right?
Yeah.
And all 22, quote, people with chronic schizophrenia, myself and the psychologist, we're holding our bellies. We're begging Herb to stop. Stop. What is so funny? This went on for 7 to 10 minutes, David. I wished somebody was surreptitiously filming me because I'd have
Yes.
it on film.
Right.
And finally, when he stopped, I waited till he wiped his eyes and got his breathing normal. And then very quietly across the room, I said, Herb, I said, would you be willing to let us know what was so funny? This man picked up his chair. He put it straight into the group for the first time. He sat in it. He looked across the room and he looked me in the eyes. And I said, what, can you tell us what's so funny? And David, he said, he looked across the room as I'm looking at you right now. And he said, Doctor, while you were talking, I suddenly realized that I've been making myself crazy with my own thinking for 47 years.
Wow.
And I don't, now that's enough. That was huge.
Yeah.
That was huge because that's what I saw, that I'd been making myself depressed for 21 years. But I did not see the second part of what Herb saw. I had hope for it, but I didn't see it immediately. But Herb said, I see that I've been making myself crazy for the last 47 years with my own thinking. And I also see that I don't have to do it anymore.
Wow. Now, were you talking about the three principles? Is that what triggered it?
I was. I had been for 3 groups. Now, we had no videos. Sid had not written any books yet. There were no videos. There were no books. I was talking from what I had picked up from inside, from what he had taught me, and people that he had talked to had taught me. And I proceeded. I started to have to get him off his medicines, his list of medicines that was very long, because as he got that realization, he stopped activating what we call the hypothalamic pituitary axis, right? Or the stress response, the flight or fight stress response that is activated within 90 seconds when we get caught up in stressful thinking. And it's meant to be activated for up to 30 minutes once every 24 to 72 hours. It is not meant to be activated like many of my clients, and probably Herb included, 12 to 14 hours a day.
Now, many people would think, okay, that's a biochemical problem in the brain.
And it is. The grain of truth is we create biochemical dysregulation. You know, Bruce Lipton, the cell biologist, says that we have 50 trillion cells. And every thought we give attention to either nourishes those 50 trillion cells or is neutral or poisons them. And every cell has 100,000 functions, 100,000 processes. So when we're caught up in stressful thinking, now we have all sorts of compensatory mechanisms that try to limit the damage that we do, but we pay a toll for that.
Okay. I'm still trying to get the 3 principles articulated, maybe in terms of 3 sentences, or because it seems like I read something on your website or someplace that kind of did that.
Yeah, universal mind. You know, now Michael Neal, the transformative coach, he says, I think mind, you're alive. Thought, you think, and consciousness, you're awake.
Yeah.
You're aware of your thinking.
But there's some kind of practice, right, that flows out of this?
No.
How would you describe the practice? No?
There's no practice. That's hard for people to even think, David. There's no practice, but I'll say, so universal mind, Sid would say, is the intelligent energy of all things, either in formless or form. It's either in formless or form. It's what allows trees to communicate to one another when a fungus hits one end of the forest. It allows the whales to go down to the same place every year and have their babies and come back with a different song that they all know every year to the Northwest. There's infinite number of examples of that. It's what allows, when I break a leg, even at 76, The doctor doesn't heal the leg. They put it in a cast and tell me not to bear weight, and 6 weeks later, it's healed. There's an intelligent energy that of all things, formless or form. That's universal mind.
Yeah.
Universal thought is the power and gift that allows us to navigate our way through life by creating thoughts and storing thoughts. And so it's a gift that it's given to us at birth to navigate our way through life. We could not go through life if we with any one of these three were missing. If we weren't alive, if we universal mind connected to that, universal thought if we didn't have, and then universal consciousness is just the gift of awareness. Everything we think looks real to us. But there are 7 billion people walking around this planet, and nobody is experiencing the same reality.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Nobody is. Now, and most people don't even know that. So they get caught up in arguing with people of who's right and who's wrong. Now, your comment about what are the practices, the best way I can say this is that anytime you understand how a system works, your behavior changes. So when a child learns how gravity works, they don't need a sippy cup anymore, because they can now, when they're through drinking their glass, they know to put it on a table.
Yeah.
You and I could be very late for a very important meeting and be on the 3rd floor of a hotel and realize that we're late for what to us is very important meeting. But because of our knowledge of gravity and understanding how the system works, we are not going to jump out the window to the street, even though it's much quicker than the elevator or the stairs. So I can see how people say, well, it changes behavior. Yes, you act in a different way, but it's because you understand how the system works. So it does change your behavior. Like when I used to get upset, I thought I was onto something. Now, you and I would say we're old enough. I have never seen a human being who was smarter when they were upset than when they were at peace.
Yeah.
I kiddingly tell people, when people are upset, there's been some studies that show that their IQ drops to an average of minus 11.8. Well, I'm making that up.
I'm going back to your example of you're late for a meeting.
Yeah.
And what goes on instead of getting upset about that?
Well, you understand that you're probably, for me, when I forget things or when I misplace things, it's usually information to me that I'm going too fast. That I've been, because I don't do that when I'm in my life and not in my thoughts. So to me, it's information. My body gives me information. Do you remember the Far Side cartoon?
I've seen it, yeah.
Gary Larson. Well, one of them, and if you take it literally, it's not funny, but it shows 2 pilots of an N-747, and they're looking out their window of their 747, and one of the pilots says to the other, he says, boy, and you see a goat on the mountain. And he says that one of the pilots says, boy, you usually don't see goats up this high. Well, 2 seconds later, they crashed into the mountain.
Right.
Now, the reason why that's poignant to me is until I started to be a sharer and a student of the principles, I often did not know that I was off glide path until I was very late for a meeting, or I destroyed a relationship, or I was flat on my back with muscle spasm, or I did something totally outside of my own moral code, because I had not realized that I had lost the path until I crashed into the mountain. What happens as people gain incremental insights into the nature of these principles, they're awake more of the time and asleep in their thinking less of the time. They're present in their life more of the time with a clear mind and a quiet mind. And so they access the wisdom beyond the intellect, in addition to being able to use, as Barbara Fredrickson says, she doesn't know why, but she knows that people in a positive feeling state seem to be smarter. And they access even the knowledge that they have much more easily.
Uh-huh.
So as people have an incremental understanding, they're awake more of the time. They're more at, they're more at ease. You've probably seen that research by the positive psychology researcher, and I'm trying to say his name, that shows that only 18% of the population is thriving. 50% are stressed. I'm okay, but I'm coping. And 32% of our population in the United States are languishing. They're overwhelmed. And at the bottom part of that, the people daily struggling with whether to kill themselves or somebody else.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me that you are citing positive psychology, which certainly is a movement that's in the direction of what you started out saying.
Right.
And so are you going to positive psychology conferences?
No.
Because you mentioned Barbara Fredrickson, who's also a positive psychologist.
Right.
Seligman might be the name you were reaching for.
Seligman at least pointed people away from taking people back into their painful past is where the solution was, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know, I mean, God love him. And he actually came to one of our three principles things in California.
Oh, really?
This is the first time I've seen, well, I shouldn't probably say that. He just was amazed at the collegial feeling among the three principles practitioners. Let me say that.
Yeah.
But I read his book and I was exhausted with, it was like the Course in Miracles. If I don't have understanding, then I have to say 30 times every day, what I see is not real. What I see is not real. But if I know what I see is not real, I don't have to say that.
Right.
So there's an understanding where you don't have to do, even our present level of understanding of resilience is that there's these 10 ways, Dr. Charney and Dr. Southwick talk about these 10 things that they've seen of resilient people, from prisoners of war, from other people. And so then you try to train. Kobasa did it back in the 60s, so trying to train hardiness. But it's a level of understanding. It's not something that you can train people. You can point. But even Sid says, I can point. Don't listen to my words. My words are the finger. If I'm trying to point this, you're trying to point to something to me, and I keep looking at your finger and saying, David, I can't see it. You would say, look beyond my finger to where I'm pointing.
Yeah, I like that example. Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah.
I'm not trying to make this complicated, because it isn't. It's so simple. I think our intellect wants it to be, it's attributed to Einstein, whether there's some debate on whether he actually said it. But the quote that's attributed to Einstein is that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. The rational analytical mind, its faithful servant.
Yeah,
however, we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
So what is it that you're doing or teaching people to try to get the message to them so that they don't have to do something routine, but that they just kind of get it? Have you discovered ways that help people not to stare at the finger?
Yeah, the most potent way in my experience is to have them read Mr. Banks's books and to watch his videos. And often we haven't got the time this morning, but I can tell you, just when his Long Beach videos came out, I had a lady that cursed me and called me every name in the book, and had come within an eyelash of killing herself, and had been in coma for three days before she came out of coma. And I said to her, I said, listen, all I'm going to ask you to do, I will discharge you tomorrow morning if you promise. I mean, if they probably would have suspended my privileges if the administrator would have heard me. If you will promise me that you'll come back in 2 weeks, if you will promise me that you will come back if you become suicidal, and if you watch these 4 videos twice through before tomorrow morning. 4 hours and 30 minutes of watching videos, right? Because they're 2 hours and 50. The next morning I came in and she had cursed me, David. She had been terribly sexually abused as a child. She was in her late 30s in multiple abusive relationships, physical and sexual relationships. She had lost hope. I said, so I asked her that. She said, fine, I'll watch your blanking videos. I'll watch your blanking videos. And I said, thank you, because that's all. I know what you want. She said, you don't know what I want. I said, yeah, I do. You're like the rest of us. You want to be at peace, where you can give and receive love and feel joy. The next morning, she came in and sat down, and she had watched them twice through. And she sat there with tears streaming down her cheeks. And I just waited. I sat quietly with her. She said, Doctor, I owe you an apology. You didn't deserve the way I called you names and talked to you yesterday. And I said, I understand. It's your apology accepted. I knew you were hurting. She said, these tears that are streaming down both cheeks, they're not tears of sadness. They're tears of gratitude. For the first time in my entire life, I feel hope that I can be at peace.
Yeah, wow.
And I saw her, David, probably 8 times, and she came to a group for 8 times. She seemed like she was fine then. So I encourage people to watch his videos and to read his books. Yeah. And I talk to people like I'm talking to you. I go through the missing link a page at a time. I've done it with professors at major universities in psychiatry. I've done it with kids as little as 10 years old that say, why aren't they teaching this in school, doctor? Why aren't they teaching? This is being taught now in a number of countries in middle school and high school.
So speaking of books, I read that you're working on a book that will be full of the sort of anecdotes that you just told us with the woman. And
yeah, it will. I actually see a series of small books, because, and I have, for people that are interested, on the other website, www.thedoctorsdrs, not spelled out, thedrspettit.com.
Right.
There's 14 podcasts, videos, and podcasts that I did for actually called the Real Change Portal. It's www.realchange.info in the UK. And I researched each one of them 3 to 10 hours. And they are, first one is One Cause and One Cure. And the next ones are Stories of Hope. And there's one on Stories of Hope, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorders, depressive disorders, PTSD disorders, schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, addictive disorders, every major category in the DSM-5. Mm-hmm. There was an article recently in the American Journal of Psychiatry called that the research is showing that there is one cause of all mental illness. They call it psychopathology factor P. And 3 of my colleagues and I are writing an article that we hope to get into a major journal. And it's explaining what factor P is and saying that there's an antidote and a vaccine to factor P, which is understanding our spiritual nature and how we're creating our experience every moment and what we have access to every day of our life.
Yeah. By the way, your website, The Doctor's Pettit, which I've been to, recommend our listeners and viewers to go to, and they will discover that your wife has partnered with you in this work.
Yes.
And she does individual counseling of people from this perspective, I would say. And And you've got a number of initiatives underway, I think, to spread this throughout the world, right?
Well, I've given up on being on a mission, but I'm gonna Bob Dylan says it's not dark yet, but it's getting there. At 76. But while there's still light, I'm just going to keep sharing as I'm guided to share, and I think, in whatever way I can, so that even long after I'm gone, there's a lot of visual material both in our website and even on YouTube and stuff. But I really think the written word, even though it's somewhat outdated to people, I think that's going to be important to have a series of books written, and I'm really in the process of doing that.
Yeah. Well, I had a whole bunch of questions to ask you, which probably would seem irrelevant, so I'm not going to do it. But I wonder if there's anything that you had planned to say, wanted to say, want to say, as we kind of wrap things up here.
Yeah. I guess, David, I feel blessed because I've been able to have now, when somebody sits in front of me, I know that they're perfectly mentally healthy. The label to me describes it's a description of where they are. It has absolutely nothing to do with who they are.
Who they are, right.
And they, at some point, when I point to that, I've had people in florid psychoses that I've told. One lady was in a very acute manic episode, was on large doses. And I told her, because it's what I saw, I wasn't making it up. I said, you are perfectly mentally healthy. You just don't know it. And when she appeared at grand rounds at West Virginia University, where I taught for 10 years and became associate professor of psychiatry, when we taught at grand rounds 6 months later, when she was fine, she said that when some resident asked her, what did you think when that doctor told you that you were in the midst of a florid psychosis, you're speaking gibberish when it comes out your mouth, you've been awake for 40 hours, you're on massive doses of medication, and he tells you you're perfectly mentally healthy. What did you think? Which was a great question, right?
Yeah, right.
And she said, the first thought I had was, oh my God, they've given me a psychiatrist that's crazier than I am. But then she said that I realized that thought came from my intellect, and it was followed by another thought from another place that said, I know that what he just said absolutely is true. And at that moment, the healing began.
Yeah. Now, there are people who are going to watch this, who are going to listen to this, who are troubled.
Yes.
Probably some who've struggled with some form of anxiety for a long time, or depression, as you did. What's your message to them?
Well, that there's hope, that there is an understanding that they already have. It's not like having to learn differential calculus. I don't know that we're given to know differential calculus, maybe at some level, but this is an understanding that we already have. If you watch small children, they live there most of the time in their life, not in their thoughts. We had to learn ourselves away from that. Yeah. That's why Keyes, that's the researcher, and he shows that little kids, incredible high percentage, 88% are thriving, and then as they get older, the thriving goes down to adulthood. It's only 18%.
Yeah,
because we started there. We started there, David. We innocently have, again, so often when people get a new understanding, they then beat themselves up. And so I say, taking responsibility without burden. I took responsibility. I saw that I had been creating my depression for 21 years, but there was no burden from that. All there was gratitude. I tell people, when you come out of darkness into the light, you can either look back into the darkness and beat the hell out of yourself for the things you knocked over and broke when you were in the darkness, or you can be filled with gratitude that you have light.
That's a great note for us to close on.
The
Dr.
more
Bill Pettit.
gratitude, the more light will come. The more gratitude will carry you to more light.
Dr. Bill Pettit, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It was my honor to do so.